Alrighty, Marie, what do you think? Let's get this thing going. So welcome everybody. My name is Ryan Donahue. I am the VP of Sales over here at Redica Systems, and I'm joined by Marie Mathews. We're going to be digging in here on some insights that Marie and our team have poured over regarding CDER warning letters for 2024 and the trends that we've been seeing. So, without further ado, we're going to get this thing going. And I want to first start off with introducing Marie. So, very pleased to have Marie. I've been working with her in preparation for this webinar, and I have learned oodles and oodles of information just in these brief conversations that we've had. So, really excited to have Marie on here. She's former FDA, 18 plus years exactly at FDA. Recipient of many FDA individual commendable service awards, a strategic advisor, monitored $1 million remediations, and also been involved in the biologics side of FDA as well as CDER compliance officer. So just a ton of things. And as of today, Marie is now the principal and CEO of the Mathews Group. So a very well-known consultancy within industry. So if you do need help with anything, Marie is a wealth of knowledge, like I mentioned, and can definitely help you all out. So I'm going to kick it over to Marie to let things get going, and we'll get started with the webinar. So, Marie.
Well, thank you, Ryan. And I just wanted to say it's been such a pleasure working with the Redica team. All of you and your data scientists and your experts have put a lot of work into pulling the information together for this presentation. So it's been a real pleasure and a privilege to be working with you all. So, but yeah, let's jump in. So we're going to be talking about a lot of the key enforcement trends that we've seen in the 2024 warning letters, which facilities have been impacted, and touch on some common inspectional findings. We're going to discuss special concerns that can lead to a regulatory action that you should be especially aware of. Warning letters that have been issued without a preceding inspection just prior to, and also emerging trends for early 2025. So we have a lot to discuss. Let's jump in.
A lot.
So this is a slide that shows you essentially where the data is coming from that we're going to be talking about today. And it's not a huge data set because we are focusing exclusively on prescription drugs. So we've weeded out a lot of the other things, and you really get to clarify what is specific to the prescription drug industry. And so this table shows that which are generic. We can't always ensure 100% that some of the other manufacturers don't make some generic products, but the ones we know for sure specialize in generic drugs. We have them flagged as generics. Where we can tell a product type, we're showing some special categories there. So if they're tagged as finished dosage forms or sterile or things like that, we've tagged they're under product type. We're also including if there was an import alert issued, which is interesting, and the time when the inspection was conducted. And so as we're talking through some of these firms, and you see that the warning letter might have extremely serious findings on it, and there's not an import alert issued, that's because their response, it was essentially promising to do enough that the FDA was saying, if you do everything that you promised, we're okay. And one of the key factors is they most likely shut down. So if I'm not saying every time you have a warning letter, it's a complete shutdown, but what I'm saying is some of these warning letters were incredibly serious. And if they didn't get an import alert, it's because they shut down. There's three buckets. You would have to shut down in this kind of severity. You would have to also promise to do a very thorough review of the batches that have already been released because they're impacted by the severity of the findings. And then you also would have had to promise a very detailed, comprehensive, holistic promise to fix things for the future, not just we promise we're going to fix things. You would have to have a response that's incredibly detailed that says how you're going to fix it and the scope of the fixes that you're promising. So it's difficult to do.
Marie, real
Yeah.
quick, going to the whole shutdown thing, is it looked upon favorably by FDA if a site proactively shuts down after receiving the warning letter to say, hey, we're going to address these issues before we put out any additional batches or whatnot?
When the severity is high, yes.
Okay.
So it's not considered to be an admission. It's considered to be management saying, hey, we're very concerned about what you found. We're concerned too.
Yeah.
And we're taking this very seriously, and we're not going to manufacture at risk. Now, sometimes if there's a drug shortage, FDA drug shortage branch may actually talk to a company, and there's a sort of negotiated discussion about
Mhm.
manufacturing at risk. But I'm
Yep.
saying taking that out of it, because that's very complex, it's considered to be a cautious take by management that they're concerned too. And there are companies on this list that their severities rose to that level, but their promises were adequate.
Got it. Great.
Now, they're going to verify that during the inspection. So you can still get in trouble from promising the world
Right.
and not delivering it during the inspection. And so then you're just kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Action is what matters, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
So this slide shows that warning letters that reference import alerts are on the rise. And I'm not surprised because as FDA really got behind during the COVID time period. So they're trying to catch up. And this is what's going to happen as they get back into catching up on their backlog of inspections. And they're going to be prioritizing the companies that are the highest risk. So those are going to have, they're more likely to have an import alert if it's a high risk product and there's significant findings. So it's not entirely surprising to see a rise in that severity as the inspections, start coming up again in numbers.
Mm.
So, so this shows the global/regional distribution of warning letters. And we're seeing some trends. The China issuance of warning letters is going down as a percentage of warning letters per inspection. India, we're still seeing some struggles with bringing those numbers down. We're going to talk about this more potentially on some of the other slides, but one of the things that I like to analyze is in the regulatory intelligence space, and that's like trying to look at what the regulators are doing in the past and what the current statements are and what they might be doing in the future. And the current administration has placed an emphasis on enhanced enforcement with foreign companies. And basically, the current president made on his campaign site, I looked at what he was saying about the pharma industry. And 2 points that involved quality, he spoke to drug shortages, saying, drug shortages are an issue, but also continued importation of drugs from companies that do have a violative history. Now, as most of us in the industry know, those are often commingled subjects.
Mhm.
But it that was a presidential promise. So, and we're seeing actions where there's a new executive order to increase use of unannounced inspections, which I've got a link to here. And so that is follow through. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is the CDER. They actually have in their manual, it's called a MAP, the Manual of Administrative Policies and Procedures. I'm terrible with acronyms, but I think that's right. they're allowed to, when they assign inspectional frequency for a firm, it's a proprietary or internal algorithm, their risk-based algorithm, but that policy guide does allow CDER to take geographic risk into account. So
Yep.
if your company is, for example, in India, and FDA sees that country or region as an area with higher risk of having OAI, basically inspections that are classified as needing follow-up, they're going to increase the amount of inspections that are going to be done in that region.
Yep.
So you're still going to be evaluated on your own merits, but you can go into a higher risk bucket because you're in a region with that. And that's not just the current administration, that's been in place. So,
Yeah. So either way, it's going to increase no matter what if you're foreign, right? Not domestic, just based on the executive order, but also you might get a double whammy based on, peer sites within your region or your area. Is that correct?
right. It's part of the risk model. And so they're going to look at your own company's risk profile. They're allowed to look at the site profile, the global, the main corporate risk profile,
Peer
the country.
organizations.
Yeah, and that procedure is publicly available.
Yeah.
So anyway. So the focus as FDA is catching up from the backlog. They are continuing to remain focused on finished dosage forms and sterile products. And that is because, again, the risk model is trying to prioritize what's considered the higher risk product. Now, I don't necessarily think APIs are necessarily lower risk, but the thinking here is FDA feels like if we visit the finished product dosage form, we have some exposure to the API quality because they're supposed to also be assessing that API quality. In a perfect world, they would not be choosing. So, because as we all know, there's things that you can really only assess at the API site. It's very difficult to do it remotely. So there is a role for both industry and FDA and the regulators to need to visit those sites. But while they're catching up, this is what in 2024 they had time to do. We're going to see a little bit of the catch up when we start talking about 2025. So stick a pin in that. We'll go back to that later.
Yeah, agreed.
So this is an interesting slide that Redica put together using their tags, which I really loved, and I would have loved to have played with this for a really long time. And it shows you the types of things you can do with their data sets, but it's also a useful heat map to show the types of things that FDA is paying attention to. Now, one thing I want to point out, there is some fluidity in how FDA cites things. So these are not absolute categories. And I'll explain a little bit how the review process works in CDER when we get a 43 in a case that in for further action to be taken by FDA. So the first thing I would do as a compliance officer is I would review the 43 and the inspection report and the supporting documentation, but we might pull it apart. So the investigator might have cited it under procedures, but at the time I worked there, and I think it's still the case, they try to keep us to about 5 citations or less on the warning letter, which means we have to group things under different headings. So, you get a 20 item 43, you're going to look for, I hate to use the word bigger root cause because that's, but basically we're going to look for the most efficient way to group those things. So you will see some discrepancies between 43s and warning letters, but most of the investigators over time read the warning letters and start citing certain fact patterns under certain headings. And
Yeah.
CDER also does have some categories that we like to always keep it under certain ones. Others are more fluid, like a poor procedure could be cited as inadequate procedure. It could end up under quality unit because the quality unit should be writing better procedures. Another point I'd like to make is that when you see all these deficiencies under quality unit, a lot of times I would remind companies in reg meetings, just because it's cited under quality unit, it often could be a lack of resources. So it doesn't mean it's a personal failing of the quality unit. It could be a resource issue. They might need capital expenditures. So, I would always remind them there could be a money problem somewhere. So this isn't just looking at the QU and saying you're bad. And so they're working with the system that they're given. So, right. Yeah.
So Marie, is this also where, you start to see, we've seen this over the years now, right? Where there's this increase in data integrity, because data integrity again can span across multiple, quality systems, if you will. So, it could span across quality unit, it could span across production, it could span across facilities and equipment. And so you see that more often in warning letters, data integrity being cited, because again, you can kind of lump, I guess,
Yeah.
that bigger root cause in air quotes.
Yeah. And data integrity is a really good example of cross-cutting citations that there's been a lot of work in CDER. I was in Office of Manufacturing Quality. They've spent a lot of time trying to really standardize how they treat data integrity findings. So they gave us, there was a lot of almost scholarship work around developing consistency. So we didn't treat one company one way and so we've got very, very, very detailed instructions of how to handle data integrity. And, that we could do a whole session just on that. But we did have certain triggers and we definitely worked up, there's definitely buckets again, where we had different buckets. We would put the data integrity, production and lab, and sometimes it was cross-cutting, but, we would always cite certain behaviors under certain citations, and we would always ask for the same remediation. We did have different levels of data integrity and remediation. We sort of had a light version that we would put in that's a little briefer. If you really had trouble with data integrity, you get the longer remediation requested. But yeah, that's been very standardized.
Yeah. And I will call this out, right? So Redica, we did work in putting this slide together, utilizing our quality system ontology. So we have these built out for human drugs GMP, human drugs GCP, et cetera. And there's some big differences here. And I think one of the hardest parts is understanding what words or phrases within an observation actually relate to the specific quality system that is being cited, because not all investigators actually call out the specific CFRs that are being cited in an observation. They're just writing the observation. And some use the turbo language and some don't. So you really have to have these types of large language models with ontologies built on top of them to be able to parse out and assimilate in a holistic view. How many times is laboratory being cited because the words sterile products or routine testing or lab controls are being said within an observation? Or for instance, with data integrity, even data integrity is not a quality system, but we've created an ontology for that because we see so many times data integrity to citations falling up under a facilities and equipment or a production citation because an investigator used the words like contemporaneous or raw data or manipulation. So again, we've done a lot of work in helping to find the needle in a field of hay, if you will, and being able to help our customers understand what those true trends are. So.
Yeah, great point. And one thing I would also like to say is remember the warning letters are more official FDA policy.
Yeah.
So that is where the concepts are standardized. So when I was a compliance officer and I received that package, you start drafting a warning letter and grouping things and saying, these seem like the 5 most important to me, and this is how I've moved things around to bucket them. But there's a lot of review to ensure that we're handling things consistently across all companies and that we're grouping them under, the best place. So I would recommend paying more attention to warning letters as to where things end up, but not to even to get too hung up on where they choose to put things. But it is the better place to look for the language of what's expected. Well, obviously, you're not going to have that in a 43. But my point is that's gone through multiple levels of review. And it's so when I would start drafting a warning letter, there's a team lead review, there's legal review, there's SME reviews, there's the final managers, like at the top, like the director has to sign off on it, or his designee. So there's a lot of standardization, and that's a great place to learn from, is from the warning letters.
Love it.
And some 43s are wrong. It's rare, but it happens. So if you see something that just makes absolutely no sense, search for in the warning letters and see if you can find clarification there. So the quality system is usually the most cited, because again, lapses in the other areas often involve a quality unit failure. So that we've already touched on how the QU isn't necessarily personally at fault, but they're not able to prevent or detect the problems that are happening in these other areas. And so a lot of times if there's many things wrong, you're just going to have to include a QU site because you can put so many things under it.
Mm-hmm.
So data integrity continues to be a hot topic. I think it's not going to go away. And I think, again, there can be an amplification loop with, the more your company has data integrity findings, the more they're going to look. Same with regions or countries. So I think this is continuing to be a high priority for FDA enforcement priorities. It certainly happens domestically and foreign, but I think it's going to continue to be an area with a lot of attention, shall we say.
Yep. Agreed.
So, and I know, so we're going to touch on a few different special topics. We're going to do a deep dive into sterile and aseptic concerns. We're going to discuss fraud and data integrity. There's a very rare cell and gene therapy warning letter, which is definitely warranting discussion. And then we're also going to discuss API manufacturers, which is near and dear to my heart, because there are a lot of things that we need to be concerned about when we're purchasing API and who our manufacturing partners are. If you are OTC or you're not sterile, we're still going to generalize some of the information to make recommendations for things that might be applicable to you. So don't worry if your exact type of operation isn't referenced, because we're going to discuss how to use these as examples in your own work. So this is an example of going into warning letters and actually pulling out themes so if you're a sterile manufacturer and you've got an aseptic line, it's very helpful to look across warning letters and see the types of things you need to think about and ensure that your own practices and procedures are going to effectively, prevent these things. Mm-hmm. So one big one that you'll see a lot on aseptic lines are disrupting first air. And so if an FDA investigator is at your site and this is observed, what it shows is that your operators are not properly trained, but they're also not properly being reinforced. So let's say you train everyone about first air and what to do. They're going to need reminders, but also it shows you're not watching them and you're not able to stop them, which is a huge concern because the practices that FDA sees during an inspection is the best it gets. There's something called the Hawthorne effect, that behaviors change when they're watched, usually for the better. Mm-hmm. So if this is the best they can do, it shows that they haven't practiced what they need to be doing. It's hard to fake it. And a lot of FDA inspectors will spend a long time. So, they have to know how to practice this to do it day to day. And the training needs to be dynamic and reinforced. So, and one thing I'd like to mention with First Air is it there's fancy ways to train operators like using VR about First Air.
Hmm.
I'm a big fan of in my day, they made us map air flows with pencils. So, and I'll be honest with you, it worked. Like I never forgot how
How do
air
you do that?
behaves. So you draw little dotted lines with arrows and draw eddies, and this was an individual teacher, a national
That's
expert who
awesome. I
had
think
us
that's
do
great.
this.
Yeah.
If I said his name, everyone would be like, "Yep, that sounds like him." It was Ron Tetzloff. But the point is how you get people to understand this is really important. It doesn't have to be expensive, but it does need to be right. But the bottom line is they're going to be really concerned if they're seeing this in front of them. And so the message is not to yell at them more before the FDA comes. It's that you have to train and practice.
Yep.
It also shows FDA that the quality unit is not on the floor and they're not catching it. And
Yep.
that's a real expertise problem as well as a resource problem, as well as there's lots of problems.
Yeah.
So that's an example of the types of things you can learn. I'm not going to read all of these to you
Yeah.
in the interest of time.
Right.
We'll talk more about RABs later, but let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
Yeah, and I will say RABs and stoppers have been very prevalent topics as of lately, not just, you know, from Redica's customer base, but also industry talk channels, LinkedIn groups, things like that. It's been a really big topic lately. So
Yeah,
yeah,
needs more attention.
yes, it does.
So, another thing I like to do is teach people that, the actual risk of humans. And one of FDA's subject matter experts likes to use a picture of Pigpen from the Charlie Brown comics,
Yeah, yeah,
but that's the image I always have in my head of, the shedding, 500 million cells per day, and you shed the entire outer layer of your skin every 2 to 4 weeks. People behave differently when they actually know that. So, again, I'm talking here about the types of things that you need to think about in your training plan, but there's a lot of things on this slide that will prevent the kinds of things that FDA sees when your employees are not handling things correctly. So you need to make sure that this is active, and you need to make sure that you're including steps that your supervision is going to catch this. Because again, they expect you to find poor aseptic practices. FDA is not your consultant. They should not have to come in and do that. This is
mhm,
a check for just really out of control things you can't even hide. So they
yeah,
know that they're seeing the best you can do. So, another issue that we see a lot in warning letters, and I think we'll continue to, is the frequent opening of RABs doors and failure to clear the line or understand the need to do it when you've opened the door. And, usually you're not just opening the door, you're also opening the door and leaning in and removing broken vials or, moving things around. So you've got that human who's shedding lots of cells and going into the RABs or part of them. So they need to fully understand this, and we continue to see firms who don't. So the types of things you see in warning letters should be considered when you're designing your training and procedures. So that's just low hanging fruit. Go ahead and make sure that you're addressing it. Yeah. So somebody had asked in one of the questions, like, how many times can you open the RAP store? And first of all, you need to understand what the manufacturer's recommendations are. You need to understand, although there are some, according to some RABs manufacturers, there's now some RABs manufacturers that aren't as good as others. So you also need to apply your own scientific risk principles and look at your risk from the standpoint of an expert on aseptic procedures and aseptic line design and airflows. And So for example, somebody's like, what do you mean an excessive number of interventions? Well, if they're constantly reaching in to clear broken vials, that's inappropriate. So fix the reason the vials are breaking.
Yes.
Don't just have your person open the RABS door 20 times leaning in, and then try to do a smoke study that shows I can lean in 20 times. So you see what I'm trying to say? Like,
You're not getting at root cause. Yeah.
right. So make sure things are operating correctly and try to minimize people having to go in and make sure it's thoughtful when you do, and then you validate
Yep.
those interventions. So I hope that helps. So again, this is an example of the types of things you can do when you're doing your inspection prep, when you're designing training, when you're writing SOPs, when you're doing failure investigations. So there's a theme coming out on transfers and separations between zones. That's a high risk area. And a lot of companies don't necessarily get it right. So when you're transitioning from A to B, looking at whether or not that contamination separation is appropriate. Carts, we're going to talk about on another slide. That's another example of a keyword search you can do of a trend that's starting to emerge. Also, whether or not rough metal surfaces and framework of the RABs not being appropriate. Basically, this is all design. So let's go to the next slide. I think I've pulled a few things out there. Yes, I did. So when they say basic design deficiencies are present, they're saying this is so bad that we're concerned that you understand aseptic processing and what's required. So they're saying this is so serious that this is something we should really not have to come in and tell you. This isn't more complex, very complicated things that, lots of people struggle with. This is a really serious issue. So basically, I would be very concerned. And that's a tip to you that FDA thinks that you're lacking the knowledge and experience to make the products properly. So take that very seriously. You need to have an expert come in and really evaluate your entire line. So just be careful there. Also, make sure you look at how the line design is forcing your operators to move. In one example, the person was having to, crouch down on the floor. What is transferred on the gown is important because then that person is moving closer to the aseptic line and that gets transferred. And even if the floor is in an aseptic area, it's still considered to be less clean. And, we consider things once it gets closer to the floor, quote unquote, dirtier. So like in one audit I was doing not that long ago, the person's gown they were seated and it was sort of bunching into the laminar airflow hood and it was entering the sterile zone. And, that's contamination directly from the person, even though they're gowned, it's again, the person's the dirtiest thing in the area. So just remember, watch out for that. So we've already talked about separation. This is more information about sort of the trust issue in terms of trust for your expertise if they're finding very simple design flaws. And the main thing is if you don't know if problems are significant that have been noted on your 483 or in a warning letter, well, I would say let's start with the 483. If you don't know how significant these things are, you really need to hire someone who understands this. So make sure you're getting a sense of importance, because I see a lot of companies end up really struggling with regulatory enforcement and being subject to further action because they just kind of didn't understand that language was hinting to them that this is a big deal. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but again, we've talked a little about the physical separation and transfer areas. Make sure you're thinking about anything that's going to contact the drug, like utensils. Don't be passing them through open air areas in a grade B without being protected. Make sure you're doing smoke studies on those areas. These are all things that we're picking up from warning letters. So this is like sitting down with an FDA expert and they're just telling you a list of things like this is really useful. Make sure you're paying attention. So we mentioned about this is a CART citation. And so basically we talked about CART and a lot of people are forgetting to do the transfer CART. What's happening on this, they don't include it in the smoke study. This is one where they did, but there's air turbulence that's visible. My guess is, yeah, there was probably improperly protected product or utensils or equipment that were being exposed from the air eddies that are picking up things from the floor, and it's then wafting over what's on the cart.
Mm.
So think about that because again, their issue, they don't mention the floor, but that's really what they're concerned about. It's that air turbulence that's kicking things up from the floor. So always be thinking about that floor. So the way I was trained with FDA, we're always thinking about the air flows in relation to the product, the people, and the floor are really significant areas. So, I mean, there's more, but I'm just saying at a minimum. So we've already talked about the cart. So yeah, here's an example of in your response. So this is where a lot of people fall down and sort of make things a little bit worse. So somebody promised that they're going to remediate the line that was mentioned. But again, you've lost trust when FDA has to come in and find your problems because they're just coming in for a short amount of time. They barely have time to look at things and then they're finding issues. You need to go further and just don't make sure you're just doing, one small part. Don't just address what they put on the 43. You need to go further. So do a complete assessment and make sure that you rebuild that trust.
So really what you're getting at there,
Yep.
though, Marie, is doing a complete root cause analysis and then applying appropriate kappas and proof that you've applied those kappas. Is that correct? Or
It's similar, yes. So it's bigger than root cause because when
okay.
there's a design issue, it's similar. I'd like to even get broader than root cause. What it
Okay.
means is the way that it's supposed to work is when the facility is designed, it's done with expertise, right?
Yep.
It's done with the right level of rigor and expertise that's put into how everything's designed. So what it means is you need to go back and kind of reopen up that process because I mean it is a root cause, but I'm just saying you're moving back into another phase where
Got it.
it's like, okay, this could indict the way other things were designed.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a root cause, but it's also another phase,
Got it. Okay.
if
That makes
that's
sense.
helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or it could be that you brought a new product in, but with an aseptic line, there's a rigor that's missing from either, a new startup or when you're bringing new products in and
Understood.
starting a new type of manufacturing.
That makes sense.
So these are examples of things that we pulled out, that Redica pulled out, and we decided to group under data manipulation, fabrication, and destruction. And these things are taken extremely seriously. That's why we have the red sign. If you have things like this happening at your company, you need to tread very carefully. This automatically means you're at risk of getting a warning letter. And you need to pay very close attention to the warning letters that FDA has issued and look for the types of corrections that they are asking for. We talked about trust. This is an indictment of how your system's functioning.
Mhm.
It's not easy for FDA to find these things. So when they do, this means there's more.
Yep.
This is highly significant. And another thing, I'm not sure if the aseptic or media fills are on this slide or another one. Yeah, there's a media fill. So one thing I wanted to mention is somebody asked why sometimes you see, 15 item 43 with no warning letter and there's, a short one that gets a warning letter. It's all severity.
Yep.
So there could be a one item warning letter. It's very rare because most companies that have something that serious, you're going to find more than one issue. But for instance, if there's a problem with your media fills, especially a fabrication issue, that has such significant impact. It means essentially if you don't have a good media fill to show that your aseptic processing and line and operators all work together to produce a sterile product, you've got no evidence that what you're making every day is
Mhm.
okay. Sterility testing does not take the place of a media fill. It can't be substituted. There's sampling error and microbiological contamination. Sterility tests are only looking for gross contamination that would be across the whole batch. You know, a tank that was sitting and grew stuff and, you know, the whole tank is contaminated. If somebody's contaminating one vial here, one vial there, sample programs really struggle to pick that up. You're not necessarily going to find it. There's so much, study sampling error and read up on it. It's, yeah. So just wanted to make that point. So this is about missing and inadequate documentation, depending on what's missing. If there's a pattern of it, this can be extremely serious as well.
Mhm.
So, it's one thing to have a really well-designed system and one little piece of something somehow goes missing and you write a good, this is missing, we've recreated it as best we can, everything's really controlled. But these types of things that are cited here, well, the first one looks like that's a lack of supporting documentation. So, but going to actual missing things that should be there, if there's a pattern of that, be very careful because that shows again your QU is not catching it. So you have less trust. And again, FDA should not be finding that for you. A big one is not recording results contemporaneously. They really don't like that. But so you
I bet.
definitely want to show people that you're recording it properly and they're doing it at the time. Because if why would you not be doing it contemporaneously? And that might be something the quality unit needs to figure out a way to make it easier. So if it's electronic, a lot of companies are going to, even iPads for certain activities, especially in materials, But anyway, the bottom line is QU should be picking up on that and trying to figure out a solution to make it easier and take the human factors into account. So, this is another one that this could really fast track you to a warning letter. We do see this more for some reason on foreign inspections, but taking records and trying to hide them during an FDA inspection is extremely serious behavior. And there could be changes in the future on how companies with this kind of history are dealt with. I won't get into it too much, but there has been some discussion about ramping up the enforcement and making
Mhm.
it more serious, but we'll see what actually happens. Again, drug shortage has been a factor, but as production ramps up in other places, if more alternatives come on the market, then I think you'll see more permanent
Yep.
type actions taken by the FDA. Maybe they won't lift the import alert as fast, or, I think this is something to be very careful of. I consider this a patient risk,
Mhm. Mhm.
but even if you're not looking at it from a patient risk perspective, this is a big business risk.
Yep.
You are really risking your ability to continue to do business with your business partners. So definitely do what you can to try and get this under control and eliminate these kinds of practices. I will say this, a lot of times the laboratory is being pressured to not report results because there's problems elsewhere in the facility. There's problems, like if it's an API plant, there might be problems in how they're making the API. Maybe they don't have the right controls in place upstream. And so that ends up being a lab problem because the capital expenditures are being made elsewhere in the facility. So again, we're continuing to talk about DI. If you do find these kinds of problems, if a regulator does, then there's some recommendations about what you need to include in your promises to the FDA, but then you also need to follow through. So this is some advice about writing an advance protocol, what it needs to include, interviews with current and former employees, because you're supposed to be thinking about products already on the market, retrospective evaluations. Chief integrity officers are trying to leave someone in place where, it's not just a consultant, but someone at your firm. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to move along, but there's some good advice there about the
Yeah.
CIO. Put this in your quality agreements because a lot of times it's hard to inspect for data integrity with your partners, and they might try to limit inspections. So make sure you're considering DI when you're writing those quality agreements. And this is the main reason ANDAs are delayed are data integrity. According to OGD, they said that at a conference in March that I attended. So next slide.
That's interesting.
So this is a cell and gene therapy component manufacturer. And you don't see as many actions taken in this space. And I think a lot of these actions are done with reg meetings or, different kinds of enforcement modes. Maybe don't assume just because you don't see a lot of warning letters in your space that everything is okay, because FDA does have other ways of encouraging compliance with different types of firms. And cell and gene therapy, I think they tend to not issue as many warning letters, but work with those companies. CBER handles those, and they do try to assist them because it's a kind of a developing area. But this is just, I want to point out that you can't just assume your suppliers are okay. You need to check Redica or FDA's databases, make sure you're following up on this. And also, you might need to visit. I mean, you need to do good supplier audits. So this is some information. They can send out a 704A request and issue warning letters based on what they see. So just be aware. I think we're going to continue to see that as FDA has backlogs. They're having some attrition and reductions in force, not necessarily to the investigators, but their support staff have been laid off. So the investigators are stretched thin. We're probably going to see some more delays. So you need to be prepared that this is something FDA is using and can take action on. So this year, we are seeing some of the catch up I talked about with API manufacturers. So FDA is aware that there's significant quality problems sometimes that are found with API at the sites. And I think we're starting to see those visits take place. And I will say, having followed FDA in some of these sites, there are many things that FDA doesn't find because they're limited on time that are significant. So just because there's been a PAI inspection at the API site, that does not mean everything's okay. You need to really think about what your higher risk API are, if it's subject to oxidation, degradation from light, oxygen, temperature, whatever. You need to understand the needs of those products and make sure that manufacturer is making them correctly, because there's a lot of impurities that form because these processes are not adequately controlled.
Mhm.
So you need to understand the risk of these API. You need to make sure that site is making them correctly and has the capability to do so. There's hygroscopic API that are being made in environments that aren't even controlling moisture at critical phases in the handling of those drugs. So drug products. So, I just want to say it's on you. Make sure you're not just checking the box. Yeah, FDA inspected. So 6 out of the 7 warning letters issued to the API manufacturers had these issues. So these are the top citations: data integrity, which we've talked a lot about on other slides. Falsifying temperature data, that's a huge deal because I don't know all the details of this particular issue, but temperature is a huge issue during synthesis and at other times. Again, that's significant. So data integrity should not be taken lightly. So investigations and deviation handling, that's an ongoing problem across many industries, but that's certainly something FDA takes very seriously. Equipment cleaning and facility maintenance, footprints inside a clean production vessel, not ideal.
Yeah.
Water leaks from sealing onto equipment labeled ready for use. That's significant. And something that, I'd like to point out, when water's coming in from a roof, that can be a vector even for salmonella because of the birds excretion up on the roof. So, that's a big deal. Even if something even if there's further steps downstream, it's considered adulteration. You don't want to have, microbial contamination added to the product, even if you feel like it's going to die later. FDA will take action against that. Impurity control and analytical testing, that's a whole webinar unto itself, but we've already talked about how that can be issues related to other things in the process, but impurities are a very, very important issue at API manufacturers, and non-compliance with contract manufacturing. So not being registered with FDA, that's low-hanging fruit. Like,
Yep.
you should know that. There's no excuse for that. Refusal and delay of inspection, FDA takes that very seriously, where they will definitely take quick and significant action on that. So those are really important issues. And this is a finished dosage form manufacturer warning letter. And we just wanted to kind of show that, different types of things that they can be pointing out. We've talked about the bird dropping and feathers, but bird droppings in general, that's a microbial risk. It's actually in their air handling unit. That's pretty extreme. So, and the fact, again, that you didn't find that yourself, or you didn't find these types of things when you're doing your supplier audits, that's significant. So the FDA shouldn't be finding things like this when they're going to you or your partner firms. So yeah, next slide. I won't read all of that to you, but basically, okay, good. I just wanted to be sure we were mostly on time,
Yep.
but we wanted to get to a few questions if everyone has time to stick around.
Yeah, while
Okay.
you're opening that, one thing I will mention to everybody that's still on, we are planning on having a broader Q&A session because we've gotten a lot of really great questions from everybody that registered, and we do want to make sure we address them because there's just too many to address within the same webinar after Marie has presented everything. So we are planning on doing a Q&A session to further on this conversation in August. Is
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. I know somebody asked why we were restricting only to prescription, and that was, just to try and target some of it is severity. A lot of the findings but I can't speak necessarily for Redica, but I know focusing on prescription drugs, you often see some of the more serious types of findings, but not always. OTC can have very serious findings when it comes to impurities and, even microbial risk for, dosage forms that have soft middles, anyway. So it's not always more serious, but it was just the way that we broke things out. So one person asked if you could choose only one key area to focus on in order to avoid a warning letter, what would it be and why? That's tough. That's like trying to choose your favorite child. Not that I'm, but it's just, there's so much, but I would say data integrity. If I had to choose, if somebody asked my personal opinion, what's the fastest way to get a warning letter? If you were trying to sabotage, I would say data integrity, because the significance is so great that it undermines trust in everything you have recorded.
Yeah.
So, if an operator is engaging in data integrity, you don't know if it's only one or if it's across multiple operators. You don't know how the extent, it just casts everything that's good in your data. It puts it under scrutiny.
Hmm.
So that's what I would say. So,
Okay.
what can industry do to prevent warning letters? Um, we actually don't issue warning letters if the response goes far enough and addresses everything.
Yeah.
That's how you prevent a warning letter. But there is it's hard to do because you have to think very holistically. A shortcut to that is kind of the five whys, but an even better shortcut is reading all the what we call the asks in the warning letters. There's a lot you can learn from the way FDA writes what they want, and there's a project that I'd like to do sometime is pull together sort of teaching warning letters because there's some where they sneak more teaching in it than others. And they're hard to find because there was pressure on FDA to be more concise because they used to issue, very long warning letters. And as part of their effectiveness review, they decided to make them more concise and try and keep them shorter. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of questions about AI, and that's interesting. So that's a whole nother that's a fun topic of that could be a whole nother webinar. But I
Okay.
would say, just touching on it very briefly, I would say it's a lot like when everybody started getting into using statistical process control in real time. You have to look at what it's actually doing and what it's able to control on its own.
Yep.
So if you're just using machine learning to study an issue and then making a decision and making a decision based on that, is there a human in the process and where? So the way sometimes investigators would cite that, something wasn't validated properly, but they were just in a data collection phase or a study phase. It wasn't actually making live adjustments during the process. So
Mm.
that's how I trained them, like when I was doing training with people, is I would say, can it control the process? Can it control a critical process parameter?
Okay.
So there's learning that's running. It might be running at the same time, but is it controlling? And that's a very crude way to look at it. But there are some experts that are doing some really interesting work around this and how it's being implemented in different industries. I've seen people study it for use, for example, with optimizing. Well, I don't want to give examples because they're proprietary, but
Yeah.
anyway, that's something I could prepare and probably talk to more and separately because PDA has a committee that's looked at this. There's a lot of work going on around this space with a lot
Right.
of recommendations being made. So that's something, if there's enough interest, we could probably put something together and present what those recommendations are. So
Interesting. All right.
that's a very quick and dirty touch on it. But I'm sure there's much better ways to say that. I haven't read the output from our committee yet
Yeah.
recently since we finalized it. Um, so let's see. What are about some live questions that have come in? Ryan, can you see any of those?
I can. And they're mostly from one person, but let's see. Application integrity policy is no longer in use, question mark.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would have to double check. I hadn't heard of it going away, but it's possible. And that's a good question for us to have with the next panel because the person that I think we're going to have would be a great person to speak to that. So that's a prompt.
Cool.
So going back to the other list, the most frequent deficiencies escalating to warning letters. Again, data integrity. I mentioned media fills if you're sterile. That is not something that you want to have significant issues with. Sterile,
Well,
there's so many, but go ahead.
Well, so going to the data integrity thing, right? So one of the questions is also paper records versus electronic records. Is the FDA close to having expectations industry should be moving to electronic systems rather than paper?
Oh, they do have expectations. So the
There's no
problem is
guidelines, right? Like there's nothing that says you need to be on electronic records.
that's a whole nother webinar. There are things that say you have to control, and the problem is the audit trails. So, for example, if you're trying to do your entire deviation system on paper, how do you, as QA, know that somebody removed a deviation that was open? How would
Yep.
you as management? How would you as corporate? So, in the old days, a really good system might have been Phyllis, who was the only one you could get a form from. And Phyllis might have had a database or something, but anyway, I'm saying it's really hard to design the kind of accountability that you need. So
Yeah.
there, in the old days, there was a lot of log
Timestamp
books,
signature,
right?
logbook.
Log books,
Log could easily be manipulated, right? Like,
so I'm very elderly, and in my day, there was a lot of log books that would track when something was opened, and the logbook is locked in Phyllis's desk, and
mhm.
so there's a way, there was a lot of discipline that could be implemented, and then
Mhm.
FDA would say, well, how do you track and trend that, which is a requirement for complaints and deviations and all kinds of things. So then the track and trending became an issue, and everybody started putting everything in Excel.
Yep.
But then data integrity, starts becoming a focus. And it's how do you know that right before FDA arrived, the six worst deviations and kappas weren't taken out of the pile when it's paper. So that's an example of the challenges. So you can say FDA can't make us be electronic, but there's all of these things you're not going to be able to do
Right.
that are very complex. And usually audit trails. So there's GAMP 5 mentions levels of use.
Yeah.
Is it review? Is it calculations? Is it I can't remember all five of them, but GAMP 5 is a good document to refer to
Okay.
where you're starting to think about the requirements of systems. And FDA does use GAMP 5 as a reference and a resource. And so it's very hard to be fully in compliance with only paper-based systems. And you're spending a lot of time trying to, like I said, I don't even know how you would, you know, prove that you are presenting all of your deviations in kappa. And
Yeah.
again, I'm going back to you're having to do this for yourself, right?
Yeah.
You as a QU head, how do you know everything's there? And then how do your, global quality unit, how do they know? So, you know, if you think of it sort of like accounting and gap accounting requirements, there's ways that you're supposed to do things so that everybody sort of has a certain level of trust in the system.
Okay. Well, I think, we're already 13 minutes over. So let's stop.
Okay.
Um, and again, I do want to mention this. We are already planning this. Marie kind of already alluded to us adding more people to the Q&A session that we're going to hold in August. So be on the lookout for that invite and registration link because I think there's going to be a lot that we can cover and uncover together within that conversation. Were you going to say something, Marie?
No, I was just reading a comment. So,
Oh,
so
cool.
yeah, talking about good data governance, and
Oh, yeah.
and that's the thing, and that's another whole webinar. That would be that's we
Well,
can talk for
we
hours.
could go into supplier oversight, right? I mean, there's so many different topics that we could build, probably a five-part webinar series on, right?
Yeah.
So
It's an interesting topic, but also, a lot of people I think don't realize how the expectations have evolved over time. So I'll just leave it
yeah,
on that.
I agree. I completely agree. They have rapidly evolved though too, with the onset of technology and et cetera, and right? And we're about to go through another evolution with AI, right?
Yeah.
So very, very interesting stuff. Okay, thank you all so much for joining. We really appreciate it. We'll be reaching out with follow-up emails regarding the webinar, and then also be on the lookout for the webinar that we plan on doing the Q&A with Marie and special guest
Yeah.
coming up in August.
Yeah.
So thank you everybody again. If we didn't get to your question, again, be on the lookout for August, and hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks, Marie.
Thanks, everyone.